welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if this is your first time visiting, which if it is your first time visiting, you're watching this in the wrong order, so go and click on Zaiden story part 1. And now I'm going to tell part 2 of Zaiden's story. So I think where I left off last video was that we had just gotten to the Queensland Children's Hospital, or we were being transferred to the Queensland Children's Hospital. So we were transferred to the Queensland Children's Hospital on a Tuesday afternoon. On Tuesday night, we went to the cardiac ward. He was there for about 6 hours before the team leader decided to send him down to ICU. So when we visited him on the Wednesday, he was still working really hard to breathe. The ICU staff were really concerned, obviously. So he'd had another echo done. He'd had a TPT tube inserted, which is a feeding tube that goes past the stomach so that he can't vomit the contents up because he was so severely malnourished. He'd had a few x-rays to make sure that either tubes were in position or to check his lungs, which they hadn't gotten any worse, but they were still pretty bad. So on the Wednesday when we got in there, the consultant sat down with me and explained that Zaiden's work of breathing would most likely be caused by the heart. So the heart was pumping way too much blood to his lungs, and the rest of his body was then missing out. So all his other organs were starting to sort of slow down. So his gut had really slowed down. He was having issues keeping food down. That's why they gave him the TPT tube. He was having troubles going to the toilet. So we were sort of, I guess, right in the thick of heart failure. So the consultant sat us down and said to us, look, he really needs a break. He has been working hard like this for a really long time. I think we should intubate him. And that was such a hard decision for us to make, because in our head it sounded like we were really either really stuck or going backwards, and that's not where we wanted to be. We thought we were moving forward. So of course, at the beginning, I was very frail and fragile. I was very upset. I just cried because I thought, oh, my poor little boy. Like, I don't know how many times I got in the car from the hospital to drive home and I called Mum and I was saying, I just don't know what to do. And there really wasn't nothing that I could do. Even though I wanted to do something, I wanted to help him, but it was completely out of my control. So on the Thursday, he was intubated and sedated. So the machine was doing the work for him, doing all the breathing work. I then heard from the consultant that unfortunately they didn't get around to discussing Zaiden on the Friday. So Zaiden was going to remain intubated until they got their discussion done. So for a whole week, Zaiden was intubated. Nothing was happening. He was flat. The machine was doing the majority of the work for him. And that week was a bit of a blur because I really didn't want to have my hands on him. I didn't want my hands hurting him because he was intubated. So they then discussed him the following Friday and decided that they were going to apply what's called a PA band. So a PA band, or a pulmonary artery band, it goes around the pulmonary artery, which is the main artery that leads blood to the lungs. So it would slow down the flow of the blood to the lungs and then distribute blood more evenly throughout Zaiden's body. There was the question of, do we do the pulmonary artery band or do we do the VSD repair? So do we go in and fix the heart? But Zaiden had been under so much stress for 8 weeks of his life that they decided that this was the right option for him. And we put our full trust in the surgical team. We put our full trust in the cardiology team, because at that time that was our main issue. We also had a little bit of input from Gen Surg, because Zaiden ended up with the beginning of neck, so NEC, which is necrotizing enterocolitis. So he had the beginning signs of that. So because the blood flow was slowed down to his digestive system and to his bowels and everything, that sort of started. So they started him on antibiotics. Gen Surg would come in and check his belly. So his belly got really, really distended. There was, like, you could see all of the veins in his tummy. It was really hard to touch. He was, I think at the end of it, he ended up pooing a little bit of blood, but that was right at the end of it. So we sort of got through all of it, and he came out on the other side of that just fine, thank goodness. But apparently it's quite common. They see a lot of it in ICU. So they finally got around to discussing Zaiden, decided to do the PA band. They took him to surgery on the Friday morning. So I think they must have, this is a very big blur for me, this part. So they took him to surgery that morning. Mum had come into the hospital with me that day. We walked down to South Bank and had lunch. And then I got a phone call just as our lunch arrived, and it was the surgeon. And he said, "Hello, Tiana. We're just letting you know we're taking Zaiden back to his room because his white cell count is too high." So he'd been under anesthetic, he was ready, they'd prepped him, they'd put lines in, they'd got him all organised and sorted. And then they turned around and brought him back to his room because his white cell count was too high. So they had done all the preliminary blood work and everything, getting him to theatre and turning around and coming back. So that was probably one of the hardest days of my life, purely because I got myself so sorted. I was like, yeah, okay, sweet, he's going in for heart surgery. Breathe, mama, it's gonna be okay. You sort of come to terms with the fact that he's going in for surgery, and then all of a sudden they turn him around and bring him back without having the surgery done. Like, anyway, I understand why they didn't do it. So then we waited a weekend again. So Zaiden by that point had been intubated for a week and a day, I think it was. So he was intubated again the whole weekend, and then they decided that, yep, okay, we'll do the surgery on Tuesday. So all weekend I watched his blood work like a hawk. So they took blood and they checked the blood cell counts, and they were going down. Then on the Sunday they went up a little bit, so I was freaking out. So the surgeon came in and said they're doing it. They're doing the surgery. So on Tuesday they came and took him to theatre. Justin came in with me that day. They took him to theatre. They did the heart surgery and they brought him back to the room. Everything was successful. So sometimes with some heart surgeries, they leave the chest open for swelling. So they had warned me about that. So when I walked in, I was sort of expecting, I mean, you don't see anything when they leave the chest open. It's all bandaged up, sterile, obviously, so that nothing is like an infection risk or anything. So I came in and he was bandaged up, and I asked if his chest was open, and it wasn't. So everything was all closed up. Zaiden behaved during the surgery, which was really fabulous. And then that was done. So then it was about 5 days of rest from that point. So just keeping him nice and sedated, nice and comfortable, pain relief, you know, just calm. Everything was really calm in that 5 days after surgery. Then they decided it was time to extubate him. So they extubated him, and he ended up getting some swelling in his mouth, which he ended up going grey and needing a bit of adrenaline and some steroids and stuff. So I think that's where they learnt that Zaiden needed steroids before they extubated him. So he was extubated, everything was looking up. We were talking about going up to the ward, which was about a week after his surgery. We went up to the ward and we were there for one night, and I come in at 7:30 the next morning, and I had a team of nurses and doctors at Zaiden's bedside. He had gone grey, his heart rate had dropped, his saturations had dropped because he'd slowed down his breathing rate. So it was a MET call. That's what happened. So I walked into all of that, and that was just the tip of the iceberg for me. I was already anxious enough about being up on the ward, and then I just lost it. So we went back down to ICU, and they discovered that he had sepsis. So he'd gone septic from his sternal wound. For the first couple of days after we got back in ICU, they tried to keep him steady and stable. He was very exhausted. But then one strange, I think it was Wednesday, we just couldn't calm him, and he was just not happy. He was so cranky, and he was wriggling about like he couldn't get comfortable. He'd had all the pain relief in the world that they could possibly give him to try and get him to rest, and then again he went grey, and the doctors came in and they decided to intubate him again because he was obviously working too hard. They discovered that he had had what was called a sepsis shower. So it was like a ball of infection under his sternal wound that had burst inwards. So it had gotten into his blood and caused him a bit of grief. Well, a bit more than grief, but so he remained intubated for the following weekend, so about 4 days, and on the Monday they decided to extubate him. So this time they gave him some steroids before extubating him, and it was to be on the antibiotics that he was on for about 2 weeks. So they said, well, he doesn't need to stay in ICU while he's on the antibiotics, he can go to the ward. So they sent him back up to the ward. So we were up on the ward for about 4 days, and then he decided to have these little breath holding episodes. So it was really random. It was just whenever he decided, and he had these little breath holding episodes. So they did what's called a cap gas or a capillary gas on him, where they do a little heel prick and they send the blood down to the machine, and it tells them all of the levels of his electrolytes. So his bicarb was too high, so it's called alkalosis. So they sent him back down to PICU or ICU because they couldn't administer the medication that he needed. So they still weren't sure why he had alkalosis, but they decided to give him this medication to sort of bring the bicarb down, which then his CO2 went up. But his CO2 had always been up. I just don't remember it being so high. But anyway, they administered this medication to help bring his bicarb down, and it was just meant to be like a couple of nights in PICU. So we just stayed a couple of nights and we went back up to the ward. So then after that little visit, Zaiden had one final bout of alkalosis, and then we bounced back downstairs again. And this time when we bounced back downstairs, we got a room with a window, so I knew we were going to be there for a little while. When we were up on the ward, he was on a little bit of low flow oxygen, and that kept his saturations up, but it sort of started progressively getting a little bit worse while we were up there, and he had had multiple x-rays on his lungs and nothing looked different. So after his heart surgery, his lungs had started clearing slightly. So his lungs were fine. He'd also had a biopsy done on his lungs when he went in for his heart surgery, which had come back negative for any sort of lung diseases or anything. They said that his lungs were just a little bit underdeveloped. So nothing wrong with his lungs. When we got back down to PICU in this instance, they started really noticing that his CO2 levels were always a little bit on the high side. So he was always between 55 and 65, where for CO2 they want them between 35 and 45. So that is quite high, and when one level is off like that, your body overcompensates. At this point, they had put him back onto high flow oxygen, but they hadn't actually added any oxygen in. It was just high flow. A lot of high air pressure up his nostrils and down the back of his throat. He had another ENT review, and they discovered that he had pharyngomalacia and a small setback jaw with a large tongue. There is no way to bypass that upper airway obstruction without moving to this section. So he went to theatre to have his central venous line put in, and as they had given him the anaesthetic, his heart rate dropped. And when you're in theatre at the Queensland Children's Hospital, the rule is that they start chest compressions when you drop below 70 beats per minute. So he had chest compressions and came back up. They had to attempt intubating him twice. They got it in on the second go. He came back to the room and he was still intubated. Then the consultant mentioned in passing that he may need a tracheostomy. So at the beginning, Justin and I were a very hard no on a trachea. We didn't think he needed it, but our only other option was to stay in ICU for a very long time on high flow, because there is no way to bypass the upper airway obstruction without moving to this section. So we were told about the possibility of a tracheostomy on like a Thursday. We were a really hard no. I'd spoken to a couple of amazing PICU mamas who have been through the tracheostomy journey. I'd spoken to the ENT nurses who look after us so well. They are the ones that have trained us up in our tracheostomy cares, and I still wasn't confident in the decision. And it's weird because I came to terms with it quite quickly, because I thought, I just want to come home. We just want him home. He's still not home. He's 5 months and he's still not home. So we had the discussion on the Monday with the doctors, ENT nurses, just having a chat about what a trachea is, how it needs to be looked after, everything. And I'll go into depth with that in another video, all about Zaiden's trachea. So on the Monday, this was our last option. We didn't have another choice. It was either this or stay in PICU for a really long time until he outgrows that large tongue, small jaw business. So we made the hardest decision of our lives to move forward and do a tracheostomy. So the ENT doctors came to us on the Tuesday and said, look, we've got a spot on Thursday if you would like to take it. There's no pressure if you want to take more time to think about it. But we were watching Zaiden struggle and we'd been watching him struggle for a long time, and the ENT doctors were certain that this was the answer. So we made the decision to move forward. We said, let's do it on Thursday. That day was the most anxiety-filled day I'd had since Zaiden was born. I thought the hardest decision I'd ever have to make was him going in for heart surgery, getting a biopsy, being intubated, but this by far was the hardest decision we'd had to make. And when it comes to making a decision about a tracheostomy, I can guarantee you, and I can say now because I'm on the other side of it, that the hardest part of it all is actually saying, yes, let's give our child a tracheostomy. I was so nervous that day that I was going to come back into the room after he'd had his surgery and just absolutely lose it in devastation that my child had a tracheostomy. But when I came back to the room that day, I couldn't stop smiling. Like, I could see his face because there were no more high flow prongs. Sorry. Like, I will never forget walking in after he'd had his surgery and seeing his little face. Like, it was just, we hadn't seen his face since he was born. He's always had tapes on with oxygen prongs and high flow prongs, and I mean, yes, he's got his tapes for his feeding tubes, but it was just amazing to see his face. So when the ENT doctor called me to let me know that he was going to go and collect Zaiden, they asked whether I still wanted his tongue tie snipped. So that was something that I haven't mentioned, is Zaiden used to have an extremely tight frenulum, extremely tight tongue tie, like right to the tip of his tongue. Like when he cried, his tongue would go like a heart because of how tight that tongue tie was. So they called me just before they went over to get him, and they said, look, we've got time today, and the doctor has said that if you'd like it done still, we would be happy to snip his tongue tie. And I felt like that was a hard decision to make too, because it made me feel like, oh my God, what if he goes backwards after this? Like, what if I've just made the wrong decision? He was amazing at breastfeeding already. What if I've just made the wrong decision to get his tongue tie snipped? So I said to Justin, let's just get it done, because it saves us having to get it done later on. It saves the hassle of trying to figure out what part of Zaiden is making him have a speech delay. It's just one less thing to worry about. So we got that done as well. And I'd asked the doctors whether that would make a difference with the way his tongue sits at the back of his throat. And they had said no. And like with his jaw sitting back, and you know, you just think, because it was so tight, you'd think that maybe it might. And between getting his tongue tie snipped and a week later, he was literally a different baby. His jaw had already come forward a little bit. He was starting to gain weight. He was having an easier time breathing. He was just doing all the things and moving forward in leaps and bounds like he should. So we had the tracheostomy done, and they keep them sedated and quite flat for about a week because they need the stoma to heal. And the stoma is the hole where the trachea sits. So they kept him quite flat for the week, and then they did the first tube change, and he was like a new baby. So they keep him ventilated for a little bit, then they start weaning the ventilation off, and then they try putting him on the Swedish nose, which is the little filter that he has on the end of his trachea. And at first they tried that with a little bit of low flow oxygen. He did really well for the first 12 hours, and he went back onto the ventilator overnight. And then the next day they decided to try him off for the 24 hours. So I thought it was a little bit quick. Sometimes you don't know what your kid's capable of until you push them. So they left him off for the whole day and he did really well. They left him off all night and he did okay. And the next morning he started having a bit of work of breathing, head bobbing. They took an x-ray and it turned out that it was too fast for him. Partial lung collapse. So they put him back on the ventilator for 24 hours and it was like start again. So instead of transitioning from the ventilator to the filter, we transitioned from the ventilator to the high flow, which wasn't as invasive as the face prongs of the high flow. So then it was the process of weaning him off the ventilation and onto the high flow. And then we hit the process of weaning him from the high flow onto the filter, to the Swedish nose. So we got through all of that. And now we are here. And we moved up to the ward on Monday. And today is Saturday. And we still have low flow oxygen for sleeping because he does some desaturations with his underdeveloped lungs, and that will come with time. He's gaining weight. He's still being fed through the TPT with plans to start adding some milk into his NG this coming week. He is getting his central line out this week, hopefully. And I think we can finally see a little bit of the light at the end of the tunnel because he's moving forward and it's looking like we might be able to bring him home soon. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below of what else you'd like to see. Because I've got a few ideas and I've spitballed a couple of ideas with some friends and I've got a few things up my sleeve that I'd like to film. But if you want to know anything in particular, leave me a comment.